So once again, 326, A.C. Gilbert, American Flyer Trains. 326 was built and in the fleet of Gilbert locomotives, steam locomotives from 1953 to 57. This one from 54 to 57, because if you believe Doyle, it's classified as a Type 2, which set it apart from the others because the large motor, which included the thicker field and the larger armature, and of course he also classified it using the fact that it had rubber-coated wiring that hardwired the motor to the tender without the jack panel and plug panel. I think this is the third 326 I've done in a year, and I've done three total, I think 336s, and they all had some commonality, which I'll mention in just a moment. This one really didn't have that signature or footprint or identity of a single thing that would made it really, really difficult to reassemble and to make adjustments on. It was a pretty incredible train. It had its problems, but I'll mention a couple of those, or had its challenges, but none were too overwhelming. Just to kind of recap, the side linkages, as I have pasted up on the board here, were in about as good a condition as I've ever seen them, including bending, no bent side linkages, no missing side linkages, no joints on the side linkages, missing, no screws, nuts, bolts, nothing was missing from any of that infrastructure parts up here. Same thing on everything else. Now there was some cosmetic damage from just the usual nicks, but as far as the chassis, the tender, all the motor components and everything else, and the boiler, no real challenges. Now the reverse unit did require a little bit of work, and I think I've already gone on this in a previous video. I had to replace one fingerboard because one of the fingers, I think as you can see, it's the one on the right. If I can get the light to shine through it. Yeah. Now it's the one on the left. Had a sizable hole in it. As a matter of fact, the tip of it is being totally supported by just one side of the finger. So that had to be replaced. Otherwise, the tender trucks, the chassis on the locomotive, everything was in good enough shape that it didn't have those signature things like rims slipping on wheels or wheels moving on axles or anything like that. Everything was in pretty good shape. It looks like the previous owner, or some owner in its lifetime, replaced the spreader bar, which is where the coupler or drawbar from the tender is connected, and manufactured his or her own. That's a pretty good little manufacturing job there out of some sheet metal. Welding or soldering a screw or nut to it. So I'll paint that for the owner, make it look a little bit more like it matches. But other than that, everything was intact. Now I am going to talk about some things that I thought made this unique in a certain respect. You've probably heard me over time, since 2015 in my videos, talk about how dirty some of these trains are. Everything from household dirt and dust and grease and oil and carbon dust and carpet fibers, human hairs, dog hairs, cat hairs, everything else in these things that may have taken hours to clean up. This one was not overly lubricated. It was not under lubricated. It is going to have some oil and grease to take off of the side linkages, which have not been washed or polished yet. My process is to wash and polish those as they are reapplied to the train. So it didn't have an overabundance of that, but it needs some cleaning primarily because of the carbon dust. Now I think over the history of all the work I've done on these trains, I think this one, and I know every time I clean one of these I'll probably say something about, well, this one has more than this than any other train. This one certainly had more carbon dust. That stuff is nasty. It is my least desirable thing to have to clean. It stains your hands. It can stain your clothes. It can stain your bench top. It can stain almost anything, and it's not difficult to remove, but it's really tedious, and it just seems to grow and grow and grow no matter how much you wipe. So it takes a lot of just wiping down to get rid of it, not grinding so much. That was the case with this one. It was everywhere, and I think that's a good thing in a way, and I'll explain that in just a minute, but still it took a considerable amount of time. Now, I've begun to identify a pattern with these trains, and that is the double springs. This one had the double brush springs, as I have identified in at least 2 other 326s and 3 other 336s that had the large motor. So I'm now believing that that was not an anomaly or a slip up on the production line. It is done purposely, and probably for the same reasons that that author I mentioned earlier in an earlier video, who did the research on this, not on trains, but on electrical motors in general, how important spring pressure is for a brush. Have you ever thought about why sometimes these American Flyer trains run better in reverse than they do forward? And I mean the steam locomotives in particular. Well, if you look at your train, you'll notice that when the wheels are going in reverse, that they're thrusting the armature to the back of the motor. They're thrusting the armature, yes, to the back of the motor, and therefore putting more pressure on the commutator and its bars and the brushes. Makes sense. So with additional pressure, you would think that you'd get better performance. And that's what this author said. He said it actually cuts down, in a way, the wear on the brushes, because if they don't have adequate pressure to the commutator, additional sparking is possible, which is additional heat generation, and that arcing will also cause the increase in carbon dust. But I think the carbon dust I found on this train was good because it wore down the brushes for the right reason. So the first thing to mention was that, of course, the increased carbon dust, which was cleaned off, the double springs. But look at these brushes. What you're seeing in the foreground are the brushes that were taken out of the motor. Look how much shorter they are than the brushes that I'm going to put in, which are brand new. Now, they're reproduction, but they're brand new. Considerable length difference. I think these double springs kept these brushes in use and being productive, that is, the older ones, because of the increased pressure and performance. But over its lifetime, it probably deposited a lot of carbon dust on the commutator and around the train, but for the right reasons. And that is, they were pressed really hard, and they were getting good contact, and it was wearing them down a little bit. But that's for the right reasons it wears them down, not for the wrong reasons. Now that brings us back to the cleaning. As I mentioned before, carbon dust was everywhere. It was really thick inside of the boiler. Thicker than normal, and it was everywhere else. It was also really thick and coated on the interior and the exterior of the field. Now you're seeing it in a very polished form, and I want to show you something that I've run into before, and that is sometimes I do find some carbon dust on the interior of the coil and the armature. This one was excessive. And notice right here, I hope that the camera will pick up how black that area is right there on the wind on the field. It was incredibly thick. Now, I don't clean the winding on the field with anything that's abrasive. I don't pick at it with X-Acto knives. I don't use rotary tools and brushes. The only thing I use to clean that off, as well as the plates, or the laminations on a field, are paper towels and alcohol. Same thing on the winding. I only used Q-tips and alcohol. But this one chunk of burned on, heated on carbon dust would not come off. So I just had to leave it on there because I'm not going to pick at it, because this insulation that's on this field wiring is really important. It's there for a reason. And it needs to stay there, so I didn't want to risk damaging the winding that's on the field. So it did leave a little chunk right there of really hardened carbon dust. And one final mention that I did grind the commutator. And of course I used my technique, which I think is a lot safer than a sandpaper stapled to a 2x4 with a hole drilled in it and then just pressing this down on some rigid surface like a 2x4 or a piece of wood and grinding this. I used a sandpaper sponge, which gives plenty. I used a very fine sandpaper sponge. They're available in most any hardware store and home improvement big box stores. And I get the finest one I can find. I punch a hole in the foam. I then put the worm gear end of the armature into a variable speed drill and then gently press this down. And the foam helps equalize the pressure so that these bars are not put in a have a less risk of being put in a non-planar relationship with each other, and therefore making the edge of these slots a little more aggressive in wearing out the brushes and probably in collecting carbon dust as well. Oddly enough, there wasn't a lot of carbon dust excessive in the slots. I have pulled out some that pushed it out, and it was just a stick, you might say, of carbon where I pushed it out like that. Not so on this one. It had some in it, but the carbon was everywhere else, very thickly. But with patience and cleaning, I got it out. So one final view of the bottom of the tender. Everything was removed, including the slide contacts and their springs. Everything was clean, polished, and put back in, including retensioning of the swipe springs, chassis, side linkages, motor components, boiler. Everything is ready for reassembly, and I think we'll have some good outcomes. I'm going to predict good outcomes and good performance and good response on this train because of this work that I didn't invent. I just applied the science, and there is the replaced fingerboard.